Professor Benesch, thank you very much for agreeing to be a featured speaker at the Asian Business and Management Conference 2013. You spoke about corporate governance in Japan, and you touched on a number of interesting areas. But one of the things I'd like to just touch on, first of all, is you talked of the differences between corporate governance, particularly between the United States and Western countries and Japan, and highlighted several key areas in which boards were different here than in the West. Can you just give a brief synopsis?
Well, of course, the comparison was mainly between Japan and actually not just the West, but most other countries. Most other countries require some number of outside directors on the board, and Japan does not. The Tokyo Stock Exchange has a rule requiring an outside board member, but that board member is, you can include in that a statutory auditor who is not a voting board position role. So Japan really has no rule requiring outside directors. That's the biggest difference. The second difference, I think, which you could say is stark compared to 90% of other countries in the world, is that Japan has no corporate governance code, no soft law, as they say, or stock exchange code of best practice that companies are required to follow. And if they don't follow it, in most cases, there would be a comply or explain requirement so that you should disclose why you did not follow the best practice. Those are two big differences.
Where does Japan get it right?
Japan gets it right in the sense of an excellent company. There's a big disparity between different companies. Some companies are very well managed here, and some companies are not. And the disparity is strongest, in one of the areas it's strongest is corporate governance. Where a company in Japan is well governed, it's because it has internal managerial rigor extending from the lower middle level ranks of the company as a matter of corporate culture. They simply have a very good, rigorous corporate culture, and so when they get to the board level, that's part of the DNA, and they will be less likely to have scandals and more likely to maximize shareholder value. Corporate culture and ethics are, at the base, pretty strong across the board here, but only for well-managed companies, not for companies, you know, you have a spectrum.
Let's talk about LiveDoor.
Yes.
How did you come to be nominated as a board member for LiveDoor?
How did I come to nominate? Well, a group of foreign investors, including some group of hedge funds, 15 or so different foreign institutions and hedge funds, was having trouble with the board just after the scandal occurred and the company was summarily delisted by the Tokyo Stock Exchange. And they were looking for independent outside directors to help clean up the place and get it right and alleviate themselves the problems. And they contacted a person I had worked with closely. He used to be the head of the JP Morgan Investment Management group and subsidiary in Japan. They were rather close, and they asked him to recommend someone. I was recommended. And I told the representatives of that group that I would act as only as a very 100% independent director, which is to say, I'll do what I think is right. That's the job of a director. You can't say anything else. That's what it is legally. But I told it to them straight. You know, I won't do things just because your group suggests that I do them. I will consider myself to be elected by all shareholders, which is the legal fact in Japan.
You created the Board Training Director Institute of Japan. How did you have the idea?
How did I have the idea? I noticed after about 8 years of working on 4 different companies in Japan, whether they be listed or unlisted or delisted, just delisted, LiveDoor or whatever, it doesn't matter about the industry. They have common dysfunctionalities, common patterns of behavior on the board, which make it difficult for an outside director to be helpful and most helpful in many cases where you are most necessary as an outside director. And those are cases of large corporate upheaval or where major restructuring is required, or a merger or selling division, et cetera, are required in order to avoid bankruptcy or shrinkage of the company and this kind of thing. In those situations, monoculture, collectivist organizations, Japanese companies have great difficulty making the hard decisions, the tough decisions, and not, as they say, sakyukuri, not just delaying it. And you run up against a lack of common skill sets and mindset as a director, which is to say, I have a fiduciary responsibility to the entire company, not just to my division in that company, not just to my boss who promoted me to this job of director. Because of those issues, the dysfunctionalities I just mentioned occurred. So to address them, I decided that it's not just law and structure. We need some changes here to affect corporate governance improvement in Japanese companies. But the other 60% of the equation is the human capital aspect. It's common skill sets, and people have to know, everyone has to know something about finance, everyone has to know something about reading financial statements, the company law, best practice, risk management, this kind of thing, M&A, or you won't be able to have, I've experienced this in my own scar tissue, as it were, you won't be able to have a living board that really makes decisions as opposed to rubber stamping what comes up from below.
So since the founding of the Board Training Institute of Japan, how many companies have turned to you for advice and help in changing their culture?
Well, it depends how you define that. You know, we have a number of seminars every 2 months, every month. So we have a seminar of 50 or 60 people. Those are on sort of drill down specific topics. Then we have a one-day course in Japanese, which is a pre-director or director training intensive course for 9 hours. It goes over a number of topics ranging from corporate law, best practice, finance, reading accounting statements, that kind of stuff. We do the same thing in English. And so, I think if you just focus on the courses which are for pre-director or director training, and the number of companies is, gosh, at this point, probably around 30 or 35, something like that. There
is certainly an idealistic element to what you're trying to do.
Yes.
It's trying to effect quite huge corporate change and societal change, in fact, in Japan. You've been doing this for some years now. Are you more hopeful now that you'll be able to be an agent for change, or less hopeful than when you first started?
I'm more hopeful. I should say it this way. When I first started, I thought this would be easier than it has been. It has been a very difficult slog for the first 4 years of significant negative salary in the form of donating to something that gave me no salary. And it was all non-deductible, but I didn't have any salary anyway, so it would have been. That's been quite painful. And along the way, I went down to a very low dip, say about a year and a half ago, where I seriously considered closing down the whole thing because I couldn't lose any more money. But at that point, we started to sort of break even. If you add in incoming donations, which were also increasing, and also get a bit more traction in terms of things like the English boot camp and seminars and notoriety, people driving to the Japanese courses as well. So that altogether means we've been above break even, at least paying me no salary, my wife no salary, for the last year and a half. And this year, it's not a measure to brag about, because it's not that much money, but we're on a track to actually pay me my first salary. So that means it's self-sustaining. At that point, if we can continue that trajectory. So I'm much more hopeful now.
One of the characteristics of that many commentators say of the Japanese psyche, if you like, or their ability to make decisions, is that they're slow to come to a particular position, but then once they've built the consensus, they're able to enact huge change and fairly fast. Do you feel there's a sea change in the corporate culture in Japan that is open to these sorts of changes in corporate governance?
Well, having lived here about 30 years so far, I can say I don't learn the same lesson every time, which is to say, yes, on the one hand, I think the pace of change is definitely accelerating. So I'm hopeful to that extent. But every time I think that, and it does happen, I usually have to look back 3 or 4 years later and say, well, it wasn't as fast as I thought or hoped it might be. Having said that, you know, it's the second derivative or something mathematically, that as the pace of change accelerates, you do reach an inflection point where it accelerates, you know, much faster. And it tips, as you say. And then we are approaching that point more because of the number of scandals and the realization that Japan's economy faces a lot of challenges on the growth side, something I've been very active on with the American Chamber of Commerce, leading a growth strategy task force there. And so that has sort of, I think, you know, when the government comes down and says we need to really get serious with the growth strategy, it lends force to the internal powers, voices in Japanese companies that are arguing for faster change.
You've spent your career in the private sector,
yes,
involved in banking, law, mergers and acquisitions, compliance, etc.
That's right.
And you spotted, in effect, what was a gap in the market and created the BDTI. Why did you create it as a non-profit?
Well, I care a lot about this corporate governance topic because in M&A you see what goes on behind the scenes, behind the curtain, and often it's pretty ugly. And you see even more of that when you sit on a lot of boards in Japan. And you find yourself to make a lot of improvement as an outside director, but you reach some limits on some of the most important issues because of the lack of skill sets and lack of training, this kind of thing being a major gap. So to me, these are partly sort of emotional topics because, you know, those when you can't accomplish what needs to be done on a board, it's not just a personal issue. It is personal pain to not just shareholders, but, you know, employees or presidents who guarantee the debts of the company goes bankrupt, this kind of thing happens. It's very painful. So it was very important to me. At the same time, doing something in training, and we are not doing anything which is politically off the wall or out of line at all, but just even when you raise the concept of doing something new with respect to corporate governance in Japan, there's always a chance that people could take it the wrong way and sort of say, well, you're doing this just to make money, and you know, we have our system and it doesn't, you know, we don't need much change. So I didn't want to be subject to any criticism, whatever. I wanted to put together the least threatening organization that was most supportable by the largest group of Japanese or foreign institutional investors or other supporters as possible, without being criticized that any particular supporter was dominating us. If you set something up as a corporation, there's always the chance that some activist fund or some foreign company or institution or anyone, a Japanese institution, could start to control you by donating a lot of money as a shareholder. And then you'd be subject to the claim or the accusation that, you know, aren't they kind of influencing the style and the content of what you teach and this sort of thing, and you lose your perceived neutrality, or the purity of your view becomes questioned. So I wanted to avoid that possibility. The other reason for creating a nonprofit, and we are a special kind of nonprofit, we are a public interest organization that's been certified by the Cabinet Office of Japan. And so that certification is very important because for the first time in history, the Japanese government has acknowledged that training about corporate governance is a good thing for society and the economy. Believe it or not, they've never done that prior to they had never done that prior to our certification. That way itself was extremely important to me, to have it realized by people in the media and companies that this is something we're doing for society, not just us.
There is a commitment to the improvement of corporate governance in the government's growth strategy, in fact published last June.
Yes.
How can they do more?
That's right, the word corporate governance appears many times in the initial June growth strategy report. They don't say exactly what they're going to do, but they have said in prior policy proposals that they would put in place a requirement for actually more than one number of outside directors to be on listed company boards. That seems to be in the process of being downside to at least one. But you watch that space. The initial proposal by the LDP was multiple outside directors. Secondly, in their May 10th interim strategy, growth strategy recommendation that the LDP Saisei Honbu, the revitalization committee came up with, which is the precursor basically of the growth strategy report. It was proposed that the stock exchange have a disclosure requirement. The companies disclose their company policy with respect to director training and who was trained and how much, and basically what was learned. And so I'm not sure what that policy is going next, but that is something, that's a very laudable policy that many other jurisdictions have. What Japan should be doing after those things is joining the 95% of economies, and that includes a lot of emerging economies as well, that have a corporate governance code, what they call a soft law, best practice code, usually promulgated by the stock exchange, that requires all sorts of best practices, nominations committee, compensation committee, audit committee structured a certain way, orientation, induction of training of new directors, this kind of thing, ongoing education. Requires compliance with those things, and if you don't comply, they call it comply or explain, the companies must disclose their precise, specific reasons for not complying, which it really is a way of causing companies to do most of the stuff 90% of the time, and 10% of the time, if they don't do it, they have to have a hard discussion with their investors as to why they're trying to justify why they're not doing it. That would be extremely powerful in the case of Japan, because companies, if the adherence rate in another economy might be 90%, it's going to be even higher in Japan. And conversely, what you don't have in Japan is enough disclosure of information about their corporate governance practices. This would accelerate that.
Professor Benesch, thank you very much.
You're quite welcome. Thank you for having us. Thank you.